Morning is Dale McGowan. He's going to talk about raising powerfully ethical kids. I'll tell you a little about Dale. He's the founding executive director of Foundation Beyond Belief, and it's a humanist nonprofit that supports charities and encourages volunteerism in the non-theist community. He's also the author or editor of 8 books, including Parenting Beyond Belief, Raising Free Thinkers, Atheism for Dummies, and In Faith and in Doubt, the first book on marriages between religious believers and non-believers. Dale's the managing editor of Atheist Channel at pathos.com and national director of the Ethical Education for the American Ethical Union, our parent organization here. He and his wife Becca live in Atlanta with their 3 children. Dale?
Thank you, Nick. Hello, everybody.
Good morning.
This is fun, I guess.
Yes.
In my work in non-religious parenting, I end up in a lot of strange situations. And one of them is the occasional interview on conservative talk radio. And about 5 years ago, I think, I was interviewed on this talk station in California. And the topic was actually the same as the one I'm talking about today, raising ethical kids. And there were 2 guests. I was on the show and also a minister from a Christian school. And I can usually do these interviews in my sleep. I've done enough of them. I know what the questions are going to be. But this one surprised me. The very first question out of the host's mouth was one I was not ready for. He said, "Without a higher power, how are you going to keep your kids off crystal meth?" Yeah, I can actually see that question coming up at some point, some sort of question about impulse control and drugs and that sort of thing. Because the first thing that occurred to him when he knew that he was going to be talking to a non-religious parent, the very first thing he thought was, but how are you going to keep him off meth? That was the first thing knocking on the back of his teeth. So I answered that instead of a higher power, I encourage my kids to engage these questions with the power of their own reason, the power of their minds. There are many compelling reasons to stay away from self-destructive things, including the fact that they are self-destructive things. It's not easy. It's not a sure thing, but nothing is. It's what we have, and it really works remarkably well. Now he threw the same question to the minister, who answered confidently that the higher power was the only option. Without Jesus, he would have no way whatsoever to keep his kids from whirling out of control into the black abyss. Only by staying tightly focused on biblical principles, he said, can kids avoid utter annihilation. Unquote. And as we got further into the conversation, I learned that both the host and the minister had gone through the requisite sort of lost years of drugs and sex and so on, only to be saved by Christ. And this can and surely does work for some. I have no problem with that. I would just love to hear more often an acknowledgement that there are other ways to achieve this. There are other ways to live an ethical life. Okay, are you ready for his follow-up question? Trust me, you are not. He said, "Now, Dr. McGowan, I got to tell you, when you talk about the power of the mind, it sounds an awful lot like Scientology to me. Can you tell me what, if anything, distinguishes your worldview from Scientology?"
Oh, wow.
What, if anything? This is what we've come to as a culture. When you advocate teaching kids to reason things out, it sounds to some like the process of auditing past lives to become an operating thetan while casting off the evil influence of Xenu, the director of the Galactic Confederacy. So I apologized for being unclear, and I assured him that I had intended to evoke nothing alien, nothing supernatural or magical by encouraging my children to think for themselves. And I've also never simply informed them that drugs are bad, so you shouldn't use drugs. That's a sort of commandment-style approach to it, and it's weak. It doesn't work to simply instruct them in this. Instead, we have talked about what they stand to lose, and what others have lost, and how addiction works, and what a fragile and fantastic thing the brain is. That last one was a big thing for me growing up. I knew that my brain, my football skills and such being what they were, my brain was the key to whatever success I was eventually going to have, and I recognized it as an asset to protect. I didn't want to risk screwing it up for any kind of pleasure or thrill, and drugs were just too unpredictable in their effects. It was a risk analysis that I made. And it was clinched by the death of my dad as an indirect consequence of very heavy smoking. So I got the message from that: when you put poisonous stuff in your body, you risk too much for too little. And I never touched so much as a cigarette. And my kids have received that same message. Their grandpa never got to meet them because he became addicted to poisonous stuff, and he paid for it with his life. You know, we were able to make a personal connection in a way that has worked well. But our public conversation about morality overall is depressingly juvenile. A few days after the Columbine High School shootings in 1999, Bob Barr, who was then a congressman from Georgia, went on camera and said if the 10 Commandments had been posted in Columbine High School in every room, the massacre would never have happened.
Yeah.
So he was actually able to picture Klebold and Harris running down the halls of the school, blazing away until they spotted the 6th commandment and dropped their guns in horror at the realization that murder is wrong. Part of the conversation we never get to is the fact that most people in any circumstance actually know what's wrong. They actually know the difference between right and wrong. The reason the insanity defense, that the person was not capable of ascertaining right from wrong, the reason it so seldom works is because it's so seldom the case. It's very rarely the case that you can say, now you murdered somebody, you know that was wrong, right? And that person says, oh my gosh, I had no idea. If only I had known that it was wrong. They actually know that it's wrong, and there was something else that trumped it. There was some other interest of theirs, some other reason that they felt justified in crossing that line. That's different from the conversation of being able to post a rule that says don't kill, and thinking that will solve the problem. So we act as if we actually have no idea where morality really comes from, if not from a list. And part of the reason that public understanding is so awful might be that the field of ethical development is weirdly young. A lot of fields you can trace back the development for hundreds of years of research that we're building on, but ethical development work primarily came into its own in the middle of the 20th century with the work of Jean Piaget. So 1940s, 1950s is when we start to really get some steam. Lawrence Kohlberg in the 60s and 70s. Those two theorists dominated ethical development understanding with their stage theories, all the way up through the late 1970s. And everyone bounced their theories off of theirs. Now, Piaget's theories, if you took psychology in college or have some exposure to ethical development, you know about the sensory motor stage. Piaget said from birth to age 2, a child has extreme egocentrism, no theory of mind developed, and no empathy. Theory of mind is a very interesting idea. It's the realization that we eventually acquire that other people are seeing the world through their own eyes, and therefore experiencing it in a way that's potentially different from my own. This is a key component of developing empathy. Prior to that, it's interesting, kids have a sort of an odd feeling of universal mind. There's a sense that mom and dad know everything that I know. Everybody knows everything that I know, and I know everything that they know. It's an interesting idea. Theory of mind is sometimes triggered, or not triggered, but evident when a child starts lying persistently. It's actually a good sign in ethical development because it shows that they are starting to recognize that there's something that maybe mom doesn't know, that I know. And I remember the first time my daughter exhibited this, 4 years old or something, exhibited it really clearly. She's walking out of the pantry with her hand behind her back and her eyes like this. And I said, "What do you have behind your back?" And she said, "Nothing." Realizing that it was possible that I would believe that. And I threw her by saying, "And where did you get the nothing?" Interesting set of theories in which he said there are basically 6 stages of moral development, and we move through these stages sequentially. He didn't apply ages to them, but said that it's essentially a sequence. We start off with morality being about avoiding pain or punishment, right? If it hurts, it's a bad thing. If it doesn't hurt, it's a good thing. Next is seeking pleasure and reward. So going beyond the avoidance of pain, but we're actually seeking reward for good behavior. The third level is conforming to norms and social acceptance. So you've got, Daddy says, good girl, after you do something, well, I've pleased someone else, therefore that's a good thing. Number 4 is following rules. Our legal system is actually based on Kohlberg level number 4. The idea that we have laws and rules, and we are to abide by those or have the penalty. Level 5, we're getting near the top now. We have what's called the social contract level, which is an understanding that we live in a set of rules and traditions, but that they are things that we created and that we can change them as circumstances warrant. That's a little more advanced level of moral understanding. And then finally, level 6 is universal moral principles, so that you are pursuing a universal good regardless of the consequences for yourself, regardless of whether you are accepted socially for it, regardless of whether it causes you pain, pain is inflicted on you for standing up for that, regardless of whether rewards are denied you. That's the highest level, Kohlberg. So later research made a lot of modifications to both of those theory sets, and you can really see why, even if you think about the Kohlberg levels. It implies that, now I'm at level 5. Okay, I worked my way up to level 5, and now I'm operating at level 5 on a regular basis. We actually all slide up and down the scale all the time. I mean, our hope is that we, at some point, get into the upper levels. I think that's the hope. But we all respond to different levels of moral incentive in different situations. An example is, I taught at a Catholic college for 15 years. I ended up losing that job as a result of a free speech issue that I advocated. And it was very difficult, and there was a lot of hate mail and a lot of bad press and all this sort of thing. And I resigned my position in disgust. Real level 6 stuff. I was very proud of having stood up for this principle of free speech. And then on the way home, on my last day, I drove the speed limit. Why? Because I didn't want a ticket. Level 1, pretty much. I was responding in the course of a single day. I wasn't, yes, I wanted everyone to be safe, I wanted myself to be safe and all this, but the main reason that I watch in my rearview mirror is that I don't want to have to pay a ticket. I'm responding at this very base level of morality, really. So we have to recognize that these are interesting principles, and they're useful principles, but they're not quite as rigid as we have thought. And research since the 70s has moved us in a more flexible direction. I want to go through some of the things that we now know with much greater confidence in terms of ethical development now that we've been through a longer phase of research. One of those is the one I mentioned earlier, which is that everything starts sooner than we previously thought. Genuine empathy, Piaget put as beginning somewhere around age 3. Prior to that, a child wouldn't exhibit empathy. We now know that genuine empathy is typically evident around 12 months, around the end of the first year. And empathy toward the primary caregiver starts sooner than that. There is evidence that, for example, if the mother is the primary caregiver and the child sees the mother in pain, a child as young as 3 or 4 months old will recognize that and respond to it empathetically. Second, that ethical development acts on existing temperament. This is something I don't like. I don't like the fact that this is true. I was a psych major at Berkeley for a couple of years, and it actually bugged me because Berkeley is a very genetic school of thought in psychology. They have a big stake in sort of the idea that a lot of personality is genetically based. I didn't want that to be the case. I wanted it to be much more environmental. And the research over time, so I quit the major. I ended up becoming an anthropology major, which was great, but it turned out I was I was mostly wrong about the emphasis in psychology. Research has uncovered that genetic predispositions play a much greater role in personality and even ethical development than was previously thought. Between 40 and 70% of temperament in a child can be traced to biology, traced to genetics, much higher than we originally thought. There are 3 temperaments. I won't get into the details, but there are 3 basic temperaments. And the nice thing is that they can all be mitigated. They can all be worked with. No temperament is a final sentence for how you're going to develop ethically. It just requires different approaches. Number 3 is that ethical development correlates very highly with healthy attachment to the primary caregiver. Attachment parenting, if you're familiar with that, has been reinforced again and again in the literature. It's something that's continuing to take deep roots. The idea that the most important thing we can do to raise powerfully ethical children is to develop a positive attachment to them early in their lives, to make them feel positively attached to their caregivers. Number 4 is that ethical, now this one's a little bit of an ego blow for parents. Ethical development happens primarily as a result of experience, not as a result of parental teaching. We'd really like to think that it's because we read Aesop's fables to them that they're so ethical, or because we demonstrated, all those things are good. That's all part of developing a good environment for them. But by far, the greatest effect on ethical development is experience, including peer interaction. It's primarily the interactions that they have with their peers and the ways that they reflect on that. Now, that's something parents can help with a lot. So, child gets pushed over on the playground or is treated badly. They're going to learn something from that about what it feels like to be treated unfairly, and what it feels like to treat someone else unfairly, and also what it feels like to be treated fairly or to treat someone else fairly. So all those things start to help them build that understanding. Parents can help them reflect on those moments, can help them articulate that. If they push someone else over, you can say, how would it feel to you? How do you think it would feel if somebody pushed you down? Very simple conversations we can have. But it's the experience itself that's primarily doing the work. Number 5 out of 6, religion is unrelated to ethical development.
I didn't hear.
Religion is unrelated to ethical development. For many years it was assumed, I think it's still commonly assumed by a lot of people, that it's not only related but necessary. It was certainly assumed by the radio interviewer. But there's been some tremendous work done on teasing out the variables. Larry Nucci is a researcher who was at the University of Illinois for many years. He's at Berkeley now. And his team has done cross-cultural research, looking at 5 different cultures at child development in longitudinal studies, and determined that children reach landmarks in ethical understanding reliably and on time, whether they are part of one religion, another religion, or no religion at all. A religion can be an effective way of putting children in situations that give them moral understanding, giving them messages that are morally helpful, and it can also do just the opposite. So it is really an independent issue. And finally, ethics has a mostly positive default. This is the great question. This is the one I remember talking to my college roommates about over a pitcher of beer. Are people basically bad or good? And that simplified question isn't terribly helpful. But knowing that our children actually tend toward ethical behavior, that's what the natural tendency is. They do not naturally tend toward unethical behavior, so long as they are raised in a pro-social family, in a pro-social culture. That's the idea. If you can put them in a basically safe and pro-social situation, they come equipped with the ability to develop into good people. But of course, I want more than good people, right? I don't just want my kids to be good. I want them to be powerfully ethical. I want them to be ethical leaders. I want them to be the ones who are actually leading the way in this. So what we have to do is take an approach that's come to be described as authoritative parenting. There are 2 different parenting styles that have been identified, 2 main styles that are advocated now by different groups, and they have terrible names. Now, this is not just my list. This is a list that comes straight out of these parenting books, out of books that advocate that. They will gladly embrace those 5 ideas. Authoritative parenting is the one that development research has actually been supporting more in the last generation. Parents have typically high expectations of maturity from their children, age-appropriate expectations of maturity. They tend to de-emphasize the power gradient between parent and child. The reasons for rules and actions are explained, and this is a very important one. The misconception is that parents on this side of the equation let their kids run wild and they have no rules. That's not the case at all. We have rules, and we explain the reasons for the rules. The children have the right to say, why do I have to do that? Why is it wrong to do this? And we have to explain it in a way that makes sense. The reason for this should be self-evident. We want our kids to be able to come up with their own rules as they go through life, their own understanding for what the right thing is to do. We can never list all of the moral situations they're going to get into. You know, the Old Testament tried. There are actually 613, is it, commandments in the Jewish tradition, not just 10. So they gave it a good effort, but there are still going to be additional situations our kids get into. So instead of giving them a list, I want to give them an understanding of what the rules and responsibilities have been in our home, for example, and then why. Let them see that here's the reasoning behind it, so that they can then continue to look for the reasoning behind other things as they go along. And one of the interesting things I did at one point to compare these approaches is I looked at 2 parenting books. My own book, Parenting Beyond Belief, which is an authoritative approach, and John MacArthur's book, What the Bible Says About Parenting, which is an authoritarian approach. And I looked at the concordances. This is a very interesting thing. The concordances are a feature that Amazon has that pulls out the 100 most common words used in the book. And I thought that'd be an interesting way to sort of get at the heart of what's going on in these books. And among the top 100 words in John MacArthur's book, top 100 words were authority, obey, obedience, duty, fear, command, law, and submit. The Parenting Beyond Belief had not one of those words in its top 100, not a single one of them. And it had words like reason, think, idea, and question in the top 100. It's a very illuminating thing. They can see that there's woven into the language itself are these 2 different approaches. Now, not all Christian parenting books are that way, are authoritarian. There's a liberal religious parenting book I looked at called Parenting with Love and Laughter, Finding God in Family Life. Doesn't include one single word in the top 100 of the MacArthur book. So this really is much more of a division between conservative and progressive than it is between religious and non-religious, and that needs to be said. So, okay, I'm going to wrap up here. I must have rambled. Okay. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is generosity. Because this is another question I frequently get in interviews. I have, right around Christmas, I always have the interviews that say, how do we keep our kids from being swept up in the greed and selfishness of the holidays? I get that question every year. And once again, the impression is there that we're the ones who are going to swoop in and protect them from their tendency toward the wrong thing. But I always answer that the best way to encourage kids' generosity is to actually get out of their way and let them be generous. And here's what I mean by that. Christmas morning, right? Kids are excited to open their gifts. But that's not what they are most excited about in my experience. When I was a kid, and in watching my own kids, they are most excited when someone else is opening a gift that they've given them, right? So it's great to get a gift, that's terrific, but when Aunt Bessie is opening this gift that my kids bought, they're vibrating, they just can't stand that she's about to see this thing that they gave them. And there's a reason for this. They are always in this receiving role. Kids are very commonly in the role of receiving things from people, and it's great, and they love to receive things, it's terrific. but they rarely get to experience the power of being the giver, of being the generous one. And they feel the power that they are about to make that person happy when that person is opening that gift. So we want to let them embrace those circumstances by getting them in those circumstances as much as possible and letting them be the powerful one. My daughter's school messed this up royally a few years ago. They had a canned food drive. And she came home. She was in kindergarten at that time. Oh gosh, so 7 years ago. She was in kindergarten, and she came home and said, "We're doing a canned food drive. We have to donate canned food because there are people who are hungry. There are people who don't have enough food to eat." I mean, it's kind of this revelation to her. So we have the food, and we have to give them the food. She was very excited about this. So we said, "Yeah, we'll do that. We'll definitely do that." The next day, she comes home and says, "Oh, guess what? The class that gets the most cans gets to go to Waffle House with the principal." So all of a sudden, it was all about Waffle House. All anybody talked about was Waffle House. Now, the fact is, they probably got 3 times as many cans for the food drive. True. They got a lot of cans. They got more than they got the previous year. But the problem is that they created a generous moment instead of creating lifelong givers. That's a different thing. If they had let the kids have the experience of being the powerful one that's alleviating this need, it would have been a more long-lasting situation. So what I recommend in these situations, by the way, you have kids who are doing a canned food drive, for example. Don't give them a $20 bill and go to the store and get the canned food. Or don't just take it off your shelf. Have them spend their own money, even if it's $3, right? And they go in and they pick out the cans and they take them up to the register and they pay for them and they bring them into school. And the feeling that they have of having done, it doesn't matter that it's $3 instead of $20 this time. What matters is that you've created a child who's able to embrace that natural feeling of generosity, feel the power of that moment, and then bring it forward into their lives to be powerfully generous, to be powerfully ethical. Thanks very much.